From Wondery, I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is a special bonus episode of The Next Big Idea. I grew up in a religious household. I remember when I was 7 or 8 years old, holding hands with my father and brother and sister during what my dad called Bible stories, basically religious ceremonies that he would conduct in our living room, and feeling what I thought was the force of God, a kind of fluttering electricity flowing through my hands, wrists, arms, and torso. By age 11, as I was preparing for a church confirmation process, I decided that my religious education didn't square with my emerging understanding of science. What did make sense increasingly was that we were the accidental byproduct of a swirling effluvium of energy and matter that was unfathomable in its breadth and beauty. Well, I'm not sure those were my words at the time, but that was the general idea. At 12, I called myself an agnostic, and at 13, an atheist. But there was a sense of loss there. I felt a loss of ritual and a loss of certainty, both certainty about where the world came from and where we could find a foundation for a moral code of some kind. I think I've been looking for the shared conviction, the passion, the community of religious belief without the religion part ever since. A few years ago, I discovered an unconventional thinker, a neuroscientist, meditation guru, philosopher, and unabashed atheist named Sam Harris. There was something about Sam's calm, contemplative, scientifically rigorous, ruthlessly pragmatic assessment of the world from the inside out, starting from our experience of consciousness, that I found fascinating and reassuring. It turns out I wasn't alone in this. Sam has written 5 New York Times bestsellers, and his weekly Making Sense podcast is downloaded more than 4 million times per month. This is despite, or maybe because of, the fact that Sam is one of the most controversial of our public intellectuals. As an outspoken atheist, he's butted heads with every kind of religious believer. And although he is politically liberal, he's been a vocal critic of what he sees as the political correctness of the anti-racist movement. In August, he published a book featuring 12 conversations from his podcast. It's called Making Sense: Conversations on Consciousness, Morality, and the Future of Humanity. In the conversation you're about to hear, we talk about all of those things, as well as the idea that Sam's belief that free will is an illusion, a view I happen to share, may in fact be good news for all of us.
If you're interested in the story behind the business headlines, check out Big Technology Podcast, my weekly show that features in-depth interviews with CEOs, researchers, and reformers in business and technology. Hi, I'm Alex Kantrowitz. I'm a longtime journalist, CNBC contributor, and the host of the show. I empty my Rolodex every Wednesday to bring you awesome episodes, so go check out Big Technology Podcast. It's available on all podcast apps. We'd love to have you as a listener.
Before we jump in, I wanted to let you know that this is a condensed version of my conversation with Sam Harris. If you'd like to hear our full 2-hour chat, where we get into why anxiety causes us to suffer things twice, what consciousness and space have in common, and how we can find a detour off of humanity's path to extinction, I hope we can, you can find it in the new Next Big Idea app, available now in the App Store and Google Play Store. The app is free, and it includes ad-free versions of this podcast, along with key insights from the best in new nonfiction, delivered in bite-sized text and audio directly from the authors. It's a whole new way of absorbing ideas, and we think you're going to love it. Just go to the App Store and search for Next Big Idea. With no further ado, here's Sam Harris. Sam Harris, it is great to have you on the Next Big Idea podcast.
Oh, great to be here.
I want to start by thanking you for doing what you do, from the meditation coaching via the Waking Up app to your podcasts and books and your tendency, some would say reckless tendency, to say exactly what you think. Mm-hmm. You've created what I consider to be a really healthy discursive space for lots of people I know. So thank you for that.
Nice. Well, that's you have hit upon really the center of the bullseye of my aspiration. So I'm happy it's working for somebody.
Part of what's fascinating to me is that it's working for so many people, right? And so I'm curious about your take on the phenomenon that is the Sam Harris following. which I find so heartening. And I think you would agree, surprising. You're someone with a perspective on the world that most people would consider quite heterodox or even depressing. An
Hmm.
atheist who believes free will is an illusion, or as you put it, neuroscience reveals you to be a biochemical puppet who encourages the consumption of hallucinogens. It's not the set of views of the world that one would think would result in creating a kind of one-person media juggernaut of sorts.
Right.
Um,
Remind me not to hire you as my publicist.
but exactly right. No, but I find it so heartening, and particularly as someone who, by the way, I decided there was no God at age 12. I decided that free will didn't make logical sense at age 19.
Hmm.
Unlike you, I feared that no one would want to be around me if I said these things out loud. And I find it incredibly hopeful to see what has happened with this response to your kind of perspective on the world. So my question is, has this been surprising to you? And how do you explain it?
Yeah, for better or worse, I tend not to form a very clear conception of what is likely to happen in over some significant time horizon. So I can't say I've been surprised because I haven't really been expecting anything particular. I mean, I've just been doing what seemed important to do at every step along the way. And so, for instance, when my first book, The End of Faith, was published and eventually became a bestseller, I mean, it was great and I guess surprising in retrospect because I can see how easily it might not have happened. I mean, for instance,
Mm,
it barely got published. I think
mhm.
it was something like 16 of 17 publishers passed in the end. So literally, it was hanging on by the whim of a single editor at Norton, who was my publisher for that book. And there've been many things like that where I just feel very lucky to have stumbled upon the right thing. So here for podcasts and apps, but for the existence of these media, clearly I wouldn't be spending so much time podcasting and creating
Mhm.
a meditation app. But there was very little foresight as I arrived at those changes in my career. I just started. I announced that I was going to produce an app before I really understood anything about what was entailed. I naively thought creating an app was analogous to creating a website and had no idea how much, had I known, I might not have done it. It took me 2 years to finally release the beta version. And so it's, again, I just, I don't have a very clear picture of the future for me professionally. And I really never have. I just keep doing the thing that seems necessary.
I have a provisional explanation for the rise in listenership and the passion that I hear from a lot of people who listen to your podcast and buy your books and use your app. Which is, what's interesting to me is combining these elements of the ritual of meditation, of the waking up app, with an interest in explaining why the world is the way it is. And then third, your interest in coming up with a kind of moral code of behavior, applying science to thinking through how we should live, right? When you think about it, these are the three critical elements that we used to get from religion, right? We got ritual, we got an explanation of reality, and we got a basis for a moral system. And this would sort of position you as a bit of a secular religious leader of sorts.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's interesting. Well, when you look at my areas of interest and expertise, it's kind of a Venn diagram where these areas overlap in a way that are fairly unique to me. I mean, it's not that I am the best meditator ever, even among Westerners who got really into it. I know people who've spent more than a decade on retreat. Um, and it's not that I'm the best scientist ever. I mean, certainly most of my work is more in philosophy, and the fact that I have a PhD in neuroscience is somewhat misleading in that I spend most of my time functioning as a philosopher of mind and a
Mm-hmm.
kind of a moral philosopher. But I don't
Right.
have a PhD in philosophy, right? So from the point of view
Mm-hmm.
of philosophers, certainly academic philosophers, I lack some credentials there, and certainly there are books that I should have read that I haven't read in philosophy. So, I'm not the the world leader, on any of these fronts. But when you stack these competencies on top of one another, it is in fact true to say that there are very few philosophers who understand science better than I do, and there are very few scientists who understand philosophy better than I do. And when you stack upon that my experience in meditation,
Mm.
honestly, I can probably number on one hand the number of people who have the grounding in science and in philosophical rigor that I do, who have the experience I have in meditation, right? So it allows me a kind of a unique vantage point on how we can combine our growing understanding of the world and ourselves through science, and to understand how knowing what's true can change our capacity to live well, right? I mean, just what does it mean to live a good life in the year 2020 with all that we know and all that we have good reason to doubt in all the legacy code we're running from religion and the confabulations of our ancient ancestors, right? I mean, there's so much that people deem sacred that is sacred merely based on the reiteration generation after generation because they were handed a book that grandma said was written by the creator of the universe, and mommy didn't want to demur, and now they're left trying to square their Iron Age religious beliefs with their growing understanding of the mind and everything we have learned scientifically. And so you get these bizarre conjunctions in normal culture where you have a trained scientist like Francis Collins, who's running the NIH, yet he's also a devout Christian, right? And when you get him talking about how his Christianity squares with his science, you get this word salad of just piety that has no intellectual grounding at all, right? So there's a hunger for a kind of consilience in our worldview where we don't have to bullshit ourselves or our children or one another about what we have every reason to believe, and yet we also know that there's something sacred. I mean, there's something profound. There's something that can be realized here that is transformative. And if it's possible to be like Jesus, whoever he was, or the Buddha, whoever he was, if it's possible to radically transform our minds and have a transfigured life thereafter, well, then we should want to discover that. But that discovery will need to be framed in 21st century language, right? It's not going to be framed in the language of 1,000 years ago, much less 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. I mean, that's my project, and it's I have a very kind of odd career through those various interests, but it's always been my goal to understand what makes life worth living and how to improve our moment-to-moment experience, and to discover how knowing more and more about the way the world works and about what's likely to happen in the future, both individually and collectively, all of that, from existential risk on down to understanding, the biology of the brain, all of that's relevant.
Yeah, I've felt for years, and actually Michael, the producer on this show, and I have talked about this over many years, this idea that we need some kind of a secular church experience. I think institutions like the TED conference and the videos consumed by hundreds of millions of people function a little bit that way, right? That the message is, this is a place where we're going to talk about things that are important for humans, that are going to make you laugh, but are also going to be grounded in science to some degree. And this comes up in your conversation in the book with Thomas Metzinger, who says, I think we need something like a secularized spiritual tradition. And you say, echoing what you've just said, what we need is a fully rational spirituality, for lack of a better word. We need an ethical worldview and methodology to substitute for the indefensible doctrines that have come to us courtesy of religion. It has to be embraced in the spirit of science with logic and empirical rigor. Do you think of this as an informal project, or might we eventually have a version with music and whatever the modern version of stained glass windows would be? I think some kind of audio visual, experience.
Yeah. Well, there's been, over the years, a lot of interest in trying to create something formally. I mean, people have come to me, wondering just how we could actually acquire buildings, that people could show up in physically on a Sunday and do something profound, which would be a counterpoint to what everyone's doing in religious buildings. So there's a hunger for a secular alternative to religion, but I'm mindful of the danger of formalizing it and creating any kind of institution around this. I mean, I've often thought that things like TED are filling that need to some degree. I mean, really, it only happens once a year, but the TEDx conferences are spawning all over the place, and they have, it doesn't check all the boxes we would want to check
Yeah.
for that,
Yeah.
because the real need is, what do you do when you want to get married or someone dies, and you need a context in which to have a proper ceremony, but you also don't want any kind of goofy secular alternative either, right? It's actually hard
Yeah.
to get the language right and the ritual right, and so yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, we definitely have not
Mhm.
solved this problem in secular culture.
Yeah, yeah. And on the subject of ritual, the power of podcasting you referenced is one of the factors that has obviously been kind of critical to your journey, which I find astonishing and again, really hopeful. Because when you think about it, it just couldn't be simpler as a technology, right? As you pointed out,
Mhm.
it's effectively like radio, but you're able to have these very intimate conversations as you would, with a friend, nestled in people's ears with a proximity that's maybe only your mother and your lovers have been that close to your ears.
Mm.
And then you're able to do it on this massive scale. And when you think of the meditation sort of guide role, it brings another level of intimacy because you're taking people through these liminal states of consciousness. I mean, your voice almost has the intimacy of an anesthesiologist,
Mm.
count backwards from 5. And again, the voice of your mother as you're falling asleep as a child or waking up. It's very powerful.
Yeah, I think this was a point that Marshall McLuhan made. There is something about audio being, as you say, right in your ear, that video, even with the same audio track, isn't, right? So when you have video, you're immediately focusing on the how things look, and you obviously you can get more information. You're getting, the facial display of emotion. I mean, you're getting. I mean, it's not that audio is a replacement for video, but it definitely is more intimate somehow when you just have the audio track. And what's more, I think this really does explain the boom in podcasting and audiobooks. Pure audio allows people to multitask, right? I mean, people,
Yeah,
if
yeah,
you're watching a video, that's all you're doing. But we all discovered an extra hour or two in our day where we could listen to audio while we were commuting or going to the gym or washing dishes or whatever it is. And that's the niche that podcasts and audiobooks have filled.
yeah, yeah. With your new book, Making Sense, I listened to it and I also read sections of it. And so I was able to compare the two experiences. And the audio experience is in so many ways so much better. I mean, like the joy and the delight that so many of your guests take in the subject matter is infectious. And you
Mm.
have the sense of like witnessing their thinking process, right? You start to feel like you know more about how they think. And this, of course, begs the question, why take a podcast and put it into a book?
Yeah, well, there are really two answers to that. One is that there's still many, many people who have not discovered podcasts, right? They can't figure out how to fit the audio into their lives, either because they don't have a commute, or they don't go to the gym, or they just don't have, they listen to music at those times and they just haven't figured audio out. And so I've heard over the years from those people, when are you going to write books again?
Mm,
Like this, I've completely lost touch with what you're doing because I don't listen to podcasts.
yeah,
And so this is just an experiment to see if I can bring some of the best episodes of the podcast to those people. But it was also an experiment in finishing the conversations that happened on the podcast, because the opportunity with bringing them into print is that I and the other contributors could refine the transcript, and we
Mhm.
stuck to the conversational structure, but we make some edits and revisions and added some footnotes, and
Mhm.
this really is an assurance that everyone involved finally said exactly what they meant on these topics, as opposed to what happened extemporaneously on a podcast. And so that was that seemed worth doing.
Hey you! I'm Andrew Seaman. Do you want a new job? Or do you want to move forward in your career? Well, you should listen to my weekly show called Get Hired with Andrew Seaman. We talk about it all, and it's waiting for you, yes you, wherever you get your podcasts.
Let's dig into some of the meat of the book. It comes out about, the first, say, half is really about consciousness, I would say, 40, 50%.
Mm.
And then you have a couple conversations that are more timely on political topics. And then the second half really addresses the future of humanity and what we can do about that future. I think it might make sense to start with the experience of consciousness and how we can modify it, which is, I think, probably mostly through meditation. I actually was listening to your conversation with Yuval Noah Harari, in which he said, "I could never have written *Sapiens* and *Homo Deus.* Would never have had the focus required to do that had I not been meditating." And that was sort of a trigger for me, because I'd had this kind of growing interest in just the data showing that this is a highly, productive exercise for people. But prior to that, I'd had associations with, crystals and other woo-woo accessories,
Hmm.
and so the idea that this could be explored from a scientific basis, and that in the process I might learn something about consciousness from a scientific perspective from the inside was, won me over. How do you think about the utility of meditation?
Well, there are really two doorways into becoming interested in meditation. The first, and certainly the traditional one, is to recognize something about your psychological suffering and to want to find some way out of it, right? I mean, so this is certainly the Buddhist framing of the whole project, that there is suffering intrinsic to life, and there's dissatisfaction because everything is impermanent, right? You're losing everything in every moment. You can't hold on to your pleasures for a moment longer than they last, and then you're left seeking them again. And so you can become interested in the mechanics of that, and the promise that there's something you can do about that is can be pretty uh, captivating. So uh, that's all you need to get started. But there's another door into this, which is more intellectual. It's just based on understanding the mind and understanding what's true and wanting to see if there's something that can be discovered about what's true uh, directly through first person experience. So, is it possible to pay more attention to the nature of experience and to the nature of your own mind, such that you actually learn something about the mind? And now this project of taking introspection seriously has been dead in the West for at least 120 or so years, right? I mean, introspection was attempted around the time of William James, and well understood at that point to have been stillborn. It became an article of faith in the West that there's really nothing that you can notice about yourself directly that is going to contribute to our third person understanding of what the mind is, or what and how it's related to anything else that exists in the world, brains included. So, I mean, I take both of those as a foundation for my interest in meditation. I'm very interested in what's true and what can be gleaned about the nature of the mind directly, experientially, but I'm also interested in deepening my sense of well-being and finding a mode of living that makes life better for me and life better for the people around me. And I mean, to frankly, to be an asshole less of the time, right? I mean, just to get out of my own way and live with an awareness that life really is fleeting. I mean, we act like we have so much time
Yeah.
to be concerned about the things we're concerned about, and the truth is, we don't know how much time we have, and yet we know however much time we have, it's very short and will seem very short in the end. And so there's a preciousness of the opportunity to live well here that meditation allows you to home in on, and you can really reset your priorities and be reminded of them on a much more frequent basis.
Yeah, I used to go through a regular exercise of just imagining that I was told I had 6 months to live or 12 months to live. And I've found that it usually I would want to quit my job and finish the novel that I've never adequately started. But I found that wasn't very useful because I love my work. And so I teased out, okay, how about 2 years to live? How about 3, 4? And I decided that 5 years to live, 60 months, was a point at which I wouldn't make radical changes to my to the work I do, which I love, but I would make changes to the way I prioritize, relationships and creative work and community. And so I have this sort of 60-month, sort of deathbed advantage.
That's
I've
very
landed
interesting.
on.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, it just having picked it up in the last few years, meditation has been an effective tool, particularly to sort of surgically to calm myself and not be buffeted about by emotion and anxiety. And when I see that happening, I haven't yet reached the point where I can just sort of summon it on demand, which I could see as being very desirable. I can see an objection, just thinking of sort of skeptics, right? I mean, Stephen Fry was hysterical in that conversation with you, where he had that great riff about like meditation as this kind of bovine aspiration, right? That we look at a cow in the field, we project ourselves into that cow. The cow chewing grass, breaking wind, dropping cow patties has achieved the height of mindfulness, And he says, when we encounter humans with the placidity of a cow, we're like, with his wonderful British accent, come on, where's the juice, the bite, the vinegar, the fun, the snap? And, though I think obviously that's largely just him having fun, it does strike me that one can maybe go too far in positing kind of equipoise and unruffledness as sort of like the apex of being. I mean, that it's a great exercise to notice experiences and then release them. But might this distance us from the thrall, from the immersion in the glorious and yes, sometimes fraught vicissitudes of human experience? Like, isn't that what it's about?
Yeah, I think there's certainly the possibility of having a false ideal of quiescence here, right? I mean, so there are several aspects of this. So there's definitely a false assumption that meditation is about becoming more and more calm and in particular without thoughts, right? So you start to meditate, or you start to try to meditate, and you're given an instruction like, pay attention to your breath. And every time your mind wanders into thought, you come back to the breath. And so from the very beginning, you recognize that the real obstacle to being able to practice any form of meditation is thinking, right? So thoughts come and they distract you from the project. I mean, you literally forget that you're even supposed to be meditating, and you're just lost in thought. And then you notice that after a minute or so, and then you come back to the breath, or you come back, if you're doing TM, you come back to your mantra. But thought is the enemy there. And for the longest time, even if someone explicitly says, well, thought isn't the enemy, you're not trying to suppress thoughts, you can even be mindful of, you still receive the message that thought is the reason why you can't pay clear attention. I mean, you're trying to practice non-distraction, and the thing that is distracting you is this automatic, identification with thought. Um, and so for the longest time, that opposition with thought gets set up, but yet the ultimate fruition of practice cannot be an incapacity for thought, right? It can't be a thought-free state because Buddhas need to be able to function in the world, right? A Buddha needs to be able to walk into a restaurant and look at the menu and order what he wants for lunch. You don't want to be catatonic as a yogi or as a meditator, and yet there's an implicit hope for something like that that gets set up in people's practice in the beginning. And there's also these experiences people have in meditation. As you grow more concentrated, you can experience a mind free of thought, or comparatively free of thought, where the mind becomes really vast and blissful and just wide open. It's just really sky-like, and there are no clouds in it, and you lose your sense of having a body, and it's just it can be exactly like a very pleasant drug trip. And then you come away, certainly in the beginning, or even for the longest time, you come away from an experience like that thinking, okay, that is what meditation is about. That was really working. I want more of that, right? And then you become a kind of heroin addict of your own meditational efforts, right? You're just seeking pleasure, and it's a comparatively wholesome pleasure, but it's still not the point of meditation in the end. And the point really is to recognize something about the nature of consciousness that is intrinsically free, that's intrinsically unconflicted and open, and can be found directly no matter what's happening.
Yeah. But it has struck me that a mistake humans tend to make, I think, is believing that there is a single optimal state of consciousness, or that there's a single optimal state to achieve. And it strikes me that we are meant to have that, we evolved to have these kind of cycles of conscious experience, right? Surges of adrenaline, fight or flight response, vigorous activity, periods of, I've built a series of digital media companies, periods of building things with teams of people, I've found to be one of life's great pleasures. And then periods of relaxation, reflection, placidity, calm. I think sometimes people lose track of this idea that the experience of calm and relaxation is sublime because it's part of a cyclical journey.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. I think what we want is not to nullify these changes in state. I think we want to be able to recover our equanimity and our best selves, ethically and psychologically, as quickly as possible, right? So, it's not that negative emotions will cease to arise, right? Like anger or fear. I think they are useful. For me, they're salience signals, right? So it's like having a startle response. If you step out into a crosswalk and you see that that a car is running a red light, and you're going to die if you don't lurch backward, you need adrenaline to help with that project of getting out of the way. But the question is, how quickly can you recover your sense of well-being after you navigate that little emergency, right? Is that the kind of thing that it traumatizes you, and now you're afraid to walk out in public? Are you stressed out all day after that? I think we want the time course of those restorations of equanimity to be very, very short, right? You want to be able to get back to your happy zero in minutes and seconds, not in hours and days.
Well, let's move on from the experience of consciousness to what we know about the science of consciousness, which is where you choose to open the book with your conversation with David Chalmers, largely about the hard problem of consciousness. Do you want to share what the hard problem is?
The hard problem is that no matter how much we come to know about the mind, and its relationship to the brain, it seems that consciousness has a unique status. We can well imagine a mind that detects visual inputs and that can navigate its environment and that can basically perform as well as a human being can. I mean, we can imagine a robot that can basically do whatever we can do, and yet there would be nothing that it's like to be that robot, right? It has all of this functional capacity, but the lights are not on. I mean, it may be that once you get a sufficiently complex information processing system, well, then the lights go on by definition. But we can imagine that that's not the case. And we certainly know from, or think we know from our own, understanding of neuroscience, that much of the mind's work and much of what the brain is doing is not associated with consciousness. So consciousness is this zone where you can report on what it's like to be you, but there are many other things your brain is doing right now. I mean, it's beating your heart, it's regulating much of your physiology, it's processing information, it's delivering all of the things you can notice about yourself into consciousness. But so much of that work is being done subliminally, right? I mean, if you're a speaker of English, you're not aware of the work that your brain is doing to find the phonemes in my stream of speech or to decode them as words, right? So it's like all of this is happening unconsciously, and you can't inspect it. So the hard problem is, why isn't all of the mind like what's happening for you in the decoding of speech right now, where you just the lights are not on, right? There's nothing that it's like to be that part of your brain, and so the problem there is that then any explanation of consciousness, the fact that it's like something to be associated with a certain kind of information processing, whatever the answer there is that explains, how the lights come on, will seem non-explanatory. It will seem like a miracle. I mean, it's just this is the hard problem of life.
This observation that consciousness appears to be totally unnecessary as we understand more and more about neurological functioning. Or even posing the question, why is consciousness necessary at all, would seem to assume that there's no such thing as free will. It's been interesting to me to watch in the last 30 years since when I first in college decided that free will didn't make sense. To me, it was a scientific argument that fundamentally, if one understands chemistry and physics, there's just not room for it. We had 14 billion years of swirling rocks and this beautiful but very slow and elaborate process of evolution, and there were no individual agents. And the idea that suddenly we had individual agency, when exactly in that process would that have emerged? That to me was as young 19-year-old Rufus, what was sort of a logical gap I could not fill. But it did make perfect sense to me that we would want to believe that we had agency, much as we wanted to believe that we could live after we died, and any number of other things. And as you have pointed out, I think it was your conversation with David Deutsch, that you said science is largely a story of us fighting our way past anthropocentrism, the notion that we're at the center of things. And it strikes me that the idea that humans have some kind of special case of agency is sort of a last holdout of anthropocentrism, of the specialness of humans to some degree, right? That somehow we can sort of defy physics. How did you first come at this conclusion?
Well, so the traditional starting point is that there's a sense that there's a real mystery to solve here, right? So the mystery is we have this experience of free will that we now have to struggle to reconcile with the physics of things, right? And that project is, thousands of years old, and many people have given up hope and just said, there is no way of combining determinism and randomness that makes sense of this notion of free will. And then there are people like Dan Dennett and other so-called compatibilists who say, well, no, it's not as bad as all that. There's actually a version of free will you can have even in a fully deterministic universe. It might all be clockwork, but the clockwork is so complicated over here where we are that effectively we have the autonomy we think we have. Like you can't talk to rocks and get them to not, fall down a hill in an avalanche, but you can talk to people and get them to change their behavior, and you can punish them and you can tax them, and we're complex systems that show a kind of autonomy, and it's that autonomy that is the free will that is, in Dan Dennett's mind is worth wanting, right? Well, let me back up for a second. So many people, when they hear that free will is an illusion, they worry that is so deflationary of the project of being a human being and getting what we want out of life. I mean, there's so many bad things that are likely to follow from that insight, psychologically and practically and politically, that even if true, it's not worth thinking about, or we have to find some way in which it's not true. And I don't agree with any of that. I think that what follows upon this insight psychologically and socially is almost entirely good. For instance, the ethics of retribution, the idea that bad people really deserve to be made to suffer because they really are the true authors of their actions. I think that does go completely out the window when you understand that free will is an illusion, that nobody actually made himself, nobody picked their parents, nobody picked the influences that caused them to be who they were based on their genetics. And that has to matter ultimately, judicially.
Yeah.
I mean, think of how differently we respond to evil people who, kill people, and the way we respond to, a grizzly bear that could escape from the zoo and start killing people, right? The way we would feel about that wouldn't have this layer of moralizing. I mean, the bear was just doing what a bear couldn't help but do on some level.
Yeah.
And it is true, in fact, to say that, psychopaths are just doing what psychopaths can't help but do. And if you had the brain of a psychopath, you would behave like a psychopath. And my argument here is that to fully understand the neurophysiology of psychopathy, to fully understand the conditions that cause like an 8-year-old child to grow into the man who becomes a prototypically evil person, the moralizing would be radically reduced. And we would just say, okay, this is a tragedy. This is a problem that needs to be solved. We would have a different picture of what's actually going on if we got rid of this notion of free will.
Mm-hmm. But if to the extent that you've said that Adolf Hitler was dealt a bad hand, right? I mean, that one of the insights that the collapse of free will makes possible is that moral judgment becomes less necessary, right? I mean, we need systems we need to discourage bad behavior, but the moral judgment that Adolf Hitler summoned some kind of personal volition is erroneous. And in the same sense, we can't take away that moral judgment and still defend the idea that Mahatma Gandhi summoned a kind of moral courage that is the reason that we cry when we watch movies about Mahatma Gandhi, right? So I think there is a loss here in terms of the stories we tell ourselves about what it means to be alive. I think the good news is that one can fully recover from that initial sense of loss, and then move on to the realization that, much as I felt when I learned there was no Santa Claus, it was like, well, there's still presents that show up, and much of the same sense that, like, even though I there's no self, I am still, having all these extraordinary experiences and part of this beautiful process of the unfurling of the universe, and it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, well, I would say that things are lost, but there's a happy asymmetry in what gets lost, right? So losing the sense that free will makes any sense at all. I mean, it's not like it doesn't exist. It's impossible to say what would have to be true of the universe for it to exist, right? Like there's just it's a completely incoherent concept. I mean, there's no space in our conception of reality that makes sense of the notion that people think they have, but it removes any real basis for hatred making sense.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
the hatred of other people.
Yes.
But it doesn't remove the basis for love. I mean, this is one of the happiest asymmetries I've ever found, because when you look at what is required to really hate somebody, you have to view them as the author of their thoughts in some real way and truly responsible for who they are. They're not victims of biology. It's not their parents' fault. It's not their bad genes that they can't account for. It's not the society that hammered them into this awful shape. It's them, right? The buck stops there, right? And when you lose that sense that even the worst demagogue or tyrant made himself, right, and is deeply responsible for who he is, well, then that smooths over a lot that's wrong with us in terms of our lust for vengeance and our tribal attitudes. But it doesn't affect love in the same way, because when you love someone, it's not the true causes of their behavior that you're focused on. What you're focused on is how you feel in their presence, right? And how you want to feel as a person, and how you want them to feel. You want them to be happy. You want them to not suffer. And you take joy in their joy. And none of that entails or requires that you believe in free will.
No, I think it's such an important point, and it should be a central tenet of the philosophy of the secular church that's emergent, because it's not obvious to a lot of people, and I'm sure you're familiar with studies. That there was one by Voss and Schooler in 2008, which showed that people are more likely to cheat on a test when prompted to think they don't have free will. So I think that often the initial response that people have to this idea is a little more cynical. But I think you're absolutely right that this lands one in a place of much just deeper empathy, right, for all sentient creatures. Hey folks, Rufus here. If you're a fan of our interviews with physicians, scientists, or entrepreneurs, then I have the perfect podcast recommendation for you, Raising Health. Previously called BioEats World, Raising Health comes from leading venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz, A16Z. Each episode, Raising Health dives deep into the heart of healthcare, biotech, and AI with A16Z general partners. Along the way, they explore the real challenges and opportunities in health and biotech entrepreneurship. Not to mention, you'll hear raw insights and actionable advice from notable guests like Omada CEO and co-founder Sean Duffy, and AI expert and In-Sitro CEO Daphne Kohler. Don't miss out. Follow Raising Health wherever you get your podcasts. Folks, if you're enjoying this conversation, we think you are going to love the Next Big Idea Club. Our new Next Big Idea app is a great place to discover the latest in eye-opening nonfiction delivered straight from the authors in text, audio, and video formats. You can download it for free in the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store. And if you want to go even deeper and support the work we're doing, become a member at nextbigideaclub.com. You can participate in our lively online community and sign up to get a carefully curated selection of the best new nonfiction books every season, chosen by Malcolm Gladwell, Daniel Pink, Susan Cain, and Adam Grant. We think you'll love it. Sign up now for 3 months absolutely free at nextbigideaclub.com. I was very interested in your conversation with Glenn Loury, who's a professor of social sciences and economics at Brown. And that conversation was largely about racism and political correctness. And Loury described political correctness as a moral signaling equilibrium where people who don't want to be thought of as on the wrong side of history suppress an honest expression of what they believe about some controversial issue. You have tested touching the third rail, as it were, violating the liberal code of conduct when it comes to recent discussions about the protests, the role of the police, and so on. What's your view on this, and has it changed? I mean, it's, as you pointed out, really only someone with your platform would have been able to take the positions that you have. And how do you reflect on it now as you look back on it?
Yeah, well, so yeah, it's been very controversial, and it's been very good that I have the independence that I have, because there's no question I would have been canceled or fired based on the topics I've touched. I mean, so the foundation of my approach here and my view is just that I am totally allergic to identity politics. And I believe for very good reason. I mean, I think all of our moral progress, really, in the end, is based on our outgrowing tribal identity, and extending the circle of morality more and more widely to encompass everyone in the end. And so any politics that seems to counsel that we take identity more and more seriously, that we conceive of it as indelible, right? It's just, even if you think you've gotten over it, you can't really have gotten over it. In fact, you are thinking you've gotten over it. It's just more of your racism, say, or sexism, or whatever it is. That's a delusion, and it's a pernicious delusion. It's leading us nowhere we want to go. I mean, it's obviously in contrast to Martin Luther King's vision of living in a world where people are judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Right? I mean, clearly we want to get past skin color if we're going to follow his arc of moral history. And we seem to have, on the left, we seem to have completely lost that and just rebooted some other program which suggests that not only are things like race and gender and other superficial characteristics, not only have we not recovered from the burden of history with respect to those variables, but we can never recover. Not only have we not recovered from these things, we have to ramify these differences. I mean, the most important thing is a person's identity. That will not give us the world we want to live in. I want to live in a world where race has no more moral significance than hair color, right? I mean, it would be completely insane for someone to ask, are there enough redheads working at our Fortune 500 companies, right? I mean, how many redheads are working at Apple right now? And does this show a systematic discrimination against redheads? We want to get to a world where it's just as insane to ask that about skin color or gender or any other variable, their sexuality. And the question is, how do we get there? Do we get there by caring more and more about personal identity, or by somehow breaking this spell and caring less and less? And I mean, as you know, based on everything else we've talked about with respect to meditation and free will, and I mean, I think you shouldn't even identify with the face you see in the mirror, right? At the end of the day, you have to break that identification. So are you going to tell me that we really have to identify with skin color and a group that has a similar shade of skin color, that's somehow super important ethically and politically? I mean, that's just absolute madness from my point of view.
Yeah, I share your concerns about some of the impacts of excessive political correctness, particularly about the potential impact on politics, in the sense that the defund the police and this sort of thing is not necessarily helpful to the liberal cause. But I think the most generous interpretation of this of political correctness, from my perspective, is that it's this kind of decision. It's an unspoken decision of a preponderance of members of a community that it's time for everyone to focus on solidarity around a singular message, right? Rather than have a dispassionate discussion of all the angles, we're going to have a period of solidarity. And I've seen in building businesses that cycles like this can be healthy. So, for instance, building digital media companies, we go through brainstorming sessions where there are no bad ideas. Then you have analytical cycles where we winnow the available ideas. Then you stop talking and do nothing but execute. So there's these sort of cycles of communities of people. And I think a case can be made that what societies are trying to do with political correctness is to sort of basically shame people into a mode of pure execution or pure solidarity. The problem for me is that we don't make an announcement saying, normally we welcome dissenting opinions. We like to analyze all the facts on the ground in a balanced, measured way. But for the next 6 months, we're not going to do this. We're going to do nothing but focus on this solidarity. It does warm my heart, to see our community come together around a sort of collective empathy about the challenge of the African American experience in this country. And I do think some healing and positive things come out of that. But I think, the absence of kind of transparency about how our basically like modes of analysis change collectively, I find very kind of bizarre and potentially dangerous.
Yeah, I'm much more pessimistic about the effect of the recent protests and this kind of eruption of what I consider to be a kind of moral panic. I mean, it's like we're acting like it's 1964, and that is quite deranging. I mean, to not acknowledge the progress that has been made. I mean, one, I think if Trump gets reelected in November, it's on the left, in my view. I mean, I just think, obviously it's, practically speaking, it requires all the people on the right to vote for him, but the left has made it so easy for them. I mean, just this flirtation with total chaos. The fact that we have NPR publishing puff pieces in defense of looting, right? I mean, it's completely insane what's happened, and the fact that the explicit message of so much of this is that, if you're not on the left, the far fringe of the left, finding racist witches everywhere to burn, you are racist. The fact that one of the best selling books in the country now are White Fragility and How to Be an Anti-Racist, and that these, when you look at these books, they're as dogmatic as any religious tracts, right? I mean, they're like blasphemy tests, essentially, when you're talking about this topic. It's I think it's quite deranging, and I think it will set race relations back in the U.S. I don't think we've seen any progress. I think we've seen regress. I mean, honestly, I believe that much of white America is experiencing something analogous to what they experienced at the end of the O.J. trial, where they noticed that what they believed they saw was a unanimous eruption of tribal solidarity that had no basis in fact, right? Or a very loose basis in fact, where it just like the racial divide was suddenly advertised as being appallingly deep in the country. Like the different reaction we saw, like just shots of, just a living room after living room and office after office filled with white and black faces having the opposite reaction to a simple verdict. In the case where the truth of the crime was well understood by everybody. I mean, virtually no sane person believed that OJ was innocent, and no sane person believed that anyone else believed that he was innocent. So you saw all the people celebrating his acquittal as in bad faith, right? I mean, that's what was so damaging about it. It's not that, the facts were really much in dispute. It was that part of the population didn't care about the facts. And I think that was sent an awful message. I don't know how long it took us to recover from that message, but it was not good for race relations. And that was a tiny event. I think what we've seen with looting and the accusations of racism everywhere, even where we know it doesn't exist, and this new religion born over a kind of a scrupulousness to find bias everywhere and to assume that every disparity in representation in our society can only be accounted for by racism, right? Any difference of outcome is racism, whether, psychological racism on the part of evil white racists or systemic racism that selfish white people have not corrected because out of their own self-interest. That's the only admissible explanation on the left right now. And again, it does have this character of a new religion. In fact, John McWhorter, the wonderful Black linguist, and I say he's Black just for those who don't know. I mean, it shouldn't be relevant that he's Black, but unfortunately it is here. Is writing a book on this phenomenon. I mean, he calls it the new religion of anti-racism. And it will be, I'm hoping, I know it will be a corrective to these other books that are, now the new catechism. I think it's been absolutely disastrous to our politics. And if we squeak by and we don't get Trump for 4 more years, I'm hoping it will relax itself. If we do get Trump, I'm sure it will just, ramp up, and then it will ramp up its counter response. And the counter response, the only logical counter response to it, unfortunately, is white identity politics. And there's nothing more appalling, given our history, than white identity politics. I mean, what could be more toxic, right? But if you're going to tell 60% of the population, day after day, year after year, that they are racist assholes, right? And that's and they're guilty of this original sin, right? Some percentage of that 62% is going to say, okay, fine, fuck you. We're going to be racist assholes. And I think that's what we're witnessing now, and it's awful to see. So I'm very pessimistic about what has happened in the last few months, and I hope we regain our senses.
Yeah. I certainly think from the last election, we know that we don't know what people think yet. We know that polls are not, the polls don't really, there's things people don't say. And I do worry that damage has been done that is not recognized or hasn't yet surfaced in the polls. I certainly agree that reckless accusations of racism are counterproductive. I think I'm a little more hopeful than you are that some of these expressions of solidarity and of just empathy with the experience of a community in this country that's undergone a lot of challenges over many, many decades and centuries, that I'm hopeful there's been some healing and some positive results of that. But in any event, it's been so wonderful talking with you, Sam, and it's clear that we will need an unprecedented degree of rational thinking on a large scale to survive our future. And I, for one, really appreciate the work you're doing to make that happen. So thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, well, thank you. It's really been a pleasure.
From Wondery, this is The Next Big Idea. We hope you've enjoyed Season 2. It's been a real pleasure having you with us for these fascinating conversations. Personally, I cannot wait for Season 3. Stay tuned for news on when to expect new episodes. And meanwhile, be sure to download the Next Big Idea app, where you'll find a complete archive of this podcast, along with audio and text summaries of the best new nonfiction books delivered to you straight from the authors. And if that hour-long conversation with Sam Harris wasn't enough for you, check out the 2-hour unabridged version available exclusively in our Next Big Idea app. If you like our show, please give us a 5-star rating and a review, and be sure to tell your friends. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. To listen ad-free, join Wondery Plus at WonderyPlus.com. In the episode notes, you'll find some links and offers from our sponsors. Please support them. Special thanks today to Sam Harris. His new book, Making Sense: Conversations on Consciousness, Morality, and the Future of Humanity, is available everywhere books are sold. You can subscribe to his podcast at samharris.org. I'm your host, Rufus Griscom. This episode was edited by our senior producer, Jonathan Miller. Caleb Bissinger is our associate producer. Our series producer is Michael Kovnat. Sound designed by Jake Gorski. And executive producers are Stephanie Jens, Marshall Louie, and Hernan Lopez for Wondery.